welcome to Bots and Beyond, your weekly dose of all things automation, mixing up end user, vendor and consultant experience to create your go-to podcast for bot-related insights. I am your host, Wayne Butterfield.
Hi, and welcome back to Bots and Beyond, your weekly dose of all things automation. This week, really interesting episode, a topic that is getting a lot of traction online at the moment, and it's Open Source RPA. And there's a couple of people in the field that are, really getting to grips with it. And one of them who, I'm sure everyone will be aware of, the RPA Jargon buster. Tolani is with us this week. We're going to talk about open source RPA. So Tolani, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
It's really good to have you on the show. I know we've been talking about having you as a guest for a while. Now, for everyone who's not aware, I think it'd be really good to get your intro and the usual who you are, what you do, and why you do it.
Okay. As you said, I'm Tolani. I do RPA. I've been doing RPA for 5 years. Pretty much Blue Prism, UIPath, Automation Anywhere, or any automation for that matter. More recently, I've kind of taken interest in the open source community sort of thing, open source RPA, which is kind of gaining steam at the moment. And the reason why I do it is because I love it. I'm passionate about it. I'm passionate about democratization and commoditization of RPA. So it's a very interesting industry.
Fantastic. And, for anyone who's on LinkedIn, you can't go a day without seeing a really insightful post from yourself. So keep up the good work there. And for anyone who's not aware, obviously Tolani will be, and we'll even hashtag RPA Jargon Busters in the post when we launch the episode. So hopefully you can get a few more followers on that as well. So I guess kind of into the meat of today's episode. So we're talking about open source RPA. I know that you experimented fairly recently because I was following your progress online. Now you've obviously mentioned a couple of the more well-known tools that you've worked with. And I can't remember whether it was Python or it was one of the open source tools that was making use of Python, and you were getting to grips with that. Kind of talk to us a little bit about that journey. What tool were you using? I know it was for experimentation reasons, but what did you think of it?
Well, the tool was Robocop. It was quite interesting because that was sort of my first sort of introduction into open source RPA. As you know, Robocop is a Python-based RPA tool. Again, I think it's quite a different journey, especially if you're coming from the sort of low-code RPA sort of tools. Coming to grips with Python coding might be a little bit different, which I kind of found very challenging at the onset. It's the passion for coding that will make you sort of go from your comfort zone to sort of a new space. So which I actually did, and I did experiment with Robocop, which is quite similar to the other tools out there, but that gives you an opportunity to use the Python libraries.
And talking about Python, was your background, you're a traditional coder? Are you, more of the, let's say the configurator rather than the developer? Like what was your actual background, and how did you find making use of a capability like Python versus no code stroke low code?
Well, I've been coding since 2010. But I started with Pascal programming language, which is not very used at this point, and I slowly progressed into C#. So I've literally been coding in C# since 2015. So it's coming from the .NET sort of background, which most of the tools are really using, UIPath, Blue Prism, and the other likes of them. So if you were going into Python, for instance, the syntax, the coding syntax is different. It's simpler. Some people might argue that it's easier to learn Python as opposed to learning any of the .NET languages like C#. So if you are coming from that kind of background, I'd say literally as a coder, it might be very easy for you to go into the open source RPA community. But if you are not a coder, you might find this very challenging because we're talking about heavy coding, not low code.
And I think that's what I really understood as well. So thank you for kind of confirming that. And I think that for me makes me a little bit nervous about even calling this RPA. And I know I've had the debate with the Robocop guys as well. Robotic process automation for me was a tool that was put in the hands of operational expertise, not necessarily in the hands of traditional coders. So again, and I think it's a debate that we can have, moving forward. But is it the real deal? If you think about even yesterday, UiPath, and this will give you an indication of when the episode was recorded, made an acquisition in the kind of API space, significant valuation, used by many of the top, 100, 1,000, 10,000 organizations globally. That feels like the real deal. What about open source? Where do you see it being used? And should organizations, large organizations, small organizations, seriously be thinking about this?
Well, open source is sort of an alternative, right? And that just means that if we're looking at commoditization, getting RPA into being a commodity, you're probably going to be leveraging open source. The reason why I say this as well is if you compare, let's say, the likes of UIPath with Robocop or Tag UI, it's more like it's not a business-led operation. So where RPA is always advertised as a business-led operation, then supported or governed by IT, it's the reverse for the open source community or the open source tools, because it has to be led sort of by IT and also governed and supported by IT. So it's created for IT kind of thing, even though it could be leveraged for business operations. But putting that in the hands of coders, you're pretty much putting that in the hands of IT to sort of govern such tool. Then coming back to the acquisition, I feel like, in my personal opinion, UiPath might not be the ideal low-code sort of tool. It's moving towards the direction of coding and towards the direction of more integrations. And you find that UiPath has, let's say, some other tool set for GitHub, for all sort of integration that would be used normally by IT developers. So it's an argument whether UiPath possibly do the same thing that any open source tool would do if you expose it to do something like that. So I feel that the open source tools have a space, and they would be in the hands of coders, in the hands of IT.
Fantastic. I think that really helps. And, that's one of the things I've always thought about UiPath, is that it is probably more developer friendly. Not that it can't be used by a layman, but is probably more easily and has been more widely adopted by the traditional developer community. So, great to kind of get your view on that. I think that's fantastic. Is there any capabilities that that you're seeing open source miss? You kind of spoke about some of maybe the additional things that they have. Is there anything that is missing? I'm always thinking of kind of control rooms, reusability, that type of thing. I mean, how easy would it be to truly replicate the end-to-end delivery lifecycle of a traditional, the BAU of RPA, with some of these open source tools? What are you giving up apart from the hefty price tag?
I'm glad you mentioned that. I think what draws people to open source is first off the license, where you have the zero license, and most of the open source tools sort of operate in the Red Hat kind of model. So it is an attractive factor, but there are other things you can gain from going open source. One is the cross-platform capability, which you wouldn't get with the traditional RPA tools. So UiPath and all the other tools like Blue Prism are all on Windows stack. You need to have a Windows PC or a Windows server to be able to operate any of the development work or orchestrate things like that. But with the open source as well, you can package code that can run in any of the very popular operating systems, Windows being one of it, Mac OS and Linux. That in terms of the orchestration, like the control room and orchestrator in the likes of UIPath, it's probably not as advanced because I think the most advanced I've seen would be the Robocop. The other vendors, open source vendors, do have other kind of open source tools for orchestration, which you would have to directly use other open source tools to be able to get that kind of functionality. And I've seen a lot of the open source tools use the Windows scheduler to kind of schedule processes or schedule tasks, which is completely different if you were looking at the sort of the low code versions of it. You have everything in the control room. You have the opportunity to see the high level view. So most of the open source tools don't have that kind of visibility over a task and things like that. Then another one that might be that again, it's very promising is the community. The community size of any of the open source tools is probably in the tens. You're probably looking at tens of thousands, probably. And again, I'm just trying to be very generous with that number. It could be lower than that because it's an emerging market. But if you compare that with the likes of, UiPath that has hundreds of thousands in terms of the community size. But again, in a few years, the open source community might actually be bigger or larger than any of the low code alternatives. The reason being that the community affords different responsibilities. You have, a project management, you have a QA, you have developers within the community.
So, we've spoken obviously about Python, Robocop being built on Python. We know that there is a large Python community. We know if you think about .NET, there's also been, a lot of legacy around .NET as well. So you can kind of understand the why there would be a number of people in and around kind of this space and interested in it. Robocop, obviously, probably the one that I'm aware of most. 12 million funded recently. Well done, guys. Been on a couple of webinars and events with them recently. Who else though is kind of in that mix? And have you tried any of the other tools other than Robocop?
So I have dabbled a bit into Tag UI. It's sort of a command line tool set. So you could actually use JavaScript or Python. So what you might find if you look closely at this open source equivalent is you have the opportunity to use Python, C#, JavaScript, Ruby on Rails, and other languages outside as well. So Robocop being the very popular one because they have a lot of funding. You have OpenBot as well, also has funding, and they might be on par with Robocop, but they are a C# based tool. So you have the Open RPA as well, which is also a sort of a .NET based tool. So a lot of the tools out there would normally be, either .NET, C# or one of those .NET, C# or Python kind of language to operate them. So I have mentioned, I know there's Tag UI, there's Robo Framework. There's a caveat on Robo Framework being that it does have something called the RPA framework, which other tools can sort of leverage. It's something that Robocop leverages for their RPA. So that just means that Robo Framework has a very big community because it's also used for test automation as well. So we could potentially see some other automation tools springing up from there. And again, if you kind of look at the, I made a document, we wrote an article, myself and Kieran on LinkedIn, and we wrote an article about the open source vendors. Going through, doing a lot of investigation, we did come across a lot of tools that wouldn't necessarily be called RPA. One being AutoHotkey, they wouldn't necessarily be called RPA, but it could be used for web automation. We came across Selenium as well, where some people in the industry are actually using Selenium for automation as well, for web automation. Some of all these tools are actually out there, and they are free. Some of them are free for commercial use, and some are sort of free for commercial use, but there's a caveat on them where you have to pay for support or you pay for cloud options. You kind of pay for kind of insurance policy on them, where there's a warranty for a number of years you can get from the vendors and commitment from the vendors. So there are a lot of them out there, but the popular ones are Tag UI, Open RPA, Robocop, RoboFramework.
And thinking about that mix of tools, and for anybody that's not, I guess, so familiar with the open source arena, do we ever see things like the Forrester Wave, the Magic Quadrant, the equivalents of those surveys, but for open source? And if we haven't so far, do you think that's kind of a gap in the market, perhaps?
Well, it's probably a gap in the market. But again, some of these open source tools, it's a little bit different for you to have them on Forrester Wave or Gartner, for instance, because they do have Gartner or Forrester Wave. They do have their criteria, which might be very, very hard to get in or to match all their criteria. Because I know, for instance, Forrester has 25 criteria to actually put people on their wave, if you get what I mean. So it's very tough. So one being, you need to have your current offerings must be on par with the others. And at this point, it's all of the open source RPA tools, they basically have the same sort of offering at the moment. So there's not a lot of innovation coming from them, which we know in a few years, in a few months, more innovation, more innovative ideas will be coming from them. So we talk about the current offer, we talk about strategy as well. It's the only ones that we've kind of seen that they have a big strategy would be, Robocop and OpenBot and Tag UI. I know Tag UI is a bit different from the rest because Tag UI is funded by AI Singapore, which they're trying to get as much AI in use in Singapore. So we might be seeing a lot of strategy coming from Singapore in terms of the open RPA space. I know OpenBot recently has bought, they acquired another company. It's a small company, startup, but they've literally acquired another startup. I think it's the Office Bot, which is sort of a consultancy for RPA. So they are coming up with a bit of strategy over there. But again, the strategy is not as defined as UiPath or Blue Prism. And, and the last one you sort of look at is the market presence. The market presence for the open source community is a bit small at the moment. What you might find is they tend to be more attractive to small and medium enterprises. And geographically, you're talking about it's very hard to explain that, but in terms of presence, the presence is quite low at the moment. But again, we're depending on, the C# community or the .NET community or the Python community to kind of raise the adoption of these tools. So again, the market presence might, over the next few months and over the next few years, we might say that the market presence might be something that's big enough. And bearing in mind that, Microsoft also has .NET Core as, open source as well. So a lot of people would leverage that. Hopefully they would leverage, the other sort of tools, with Microsoft and IBM and all these people sort of joining. The competition is very tight. And, we're hoping to see more and more adoption. For me, that's what I'm hoping to see.
Talking about Microsoft and obviously talking about, the recent waves, etc. There's, I would say, probably the most shocking Forrester Wave, certainly the one that got talked about the most in recent memory, was not long out. Obviously, we saw Microsoft and Cryon enter the top right, and we saw Blue Prism drop. And there was a lot of debate about the validity of this wave now post some of these changes, and discussions about backhanders and money and I know Francis Carden spoke about it being a very tightly contested, and 1 point swing either way would have meant you were a leader or a challenger. So I don't know what your views are, kind of just to close out the episode, just thinking about the traditional players, the non-open source players, kind of what your take was on the recent wave and how you interpreted it.
I think it was very shocking. And why that was shocking for most people is a lot of people tend to compare the Forrester wave with the Magic Quadrant, Gartner's Magic Quadrant. And the Gartner's Magic Quadrant always has, since 2019, when they've started the quadrant, they've always had the big trees. And a lot of people, I've kind of just, it's Blue Prism, it's UiPath, it's, automation anywhere. And people, pretty much we know what's going to come out in the next one as well, and seeing that Blue Prism was, sort of moved from that, that leader's position to sort of strong performer was a bit shocking. But it was eye-opening. But again, I know Blue Prism, if you judge based on the, the scoring as well, Blue Prism really scored very low on strategy. And I think because the strategy, again, it depends on what they call strategy as well. UiPath strategy is a bit, it's very aggressive. They're doing a lot of integration, which is very good. For us to have that aggression in terms of strategy. So I think if you're comparing that, the UiPath strategy to Blue Prism, it's a little bit different. And also, I think what might have an influence on that might have been, the geographical presence. You're talking about, Blue Prism is well used in Europe, for instance. And I've seen a lot of mature RPA deployments being done with Blue Prism, even though I've seen some with UiPath, but again, it's a little bit different. So I saw that and I was a bit, at first I was a bit shocked. And it was worrying for some clients that had, Blue Prism deployment. But again, it's one of those things where, with the way things are going, one of the open source RPA tools might actually just rise up and get to the point of, again, not to leader, but visionary or challenges. But again, I see that in the near future. So, but I think it's one of those quadrants. I don't even think people use that as a judging factor to buy some of these RPA tools, because it's always going to be dependent on how they function within your ecosystem. And if Blue Prism works for you, then it's probably Blue Prism, regardless of what Forrester or Gartner says, in my opinion.
Great. Well, as I say, great to get your kind of viewpoint on that. It was certainly an area of great discussion and debate online. So good to kind of get your views on air as well. So thank you. I think that kind of brings our episode to a close. Brilliant episode. Really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you ever so much for joining us on Bots and Beyond. I think the whole listening community will now be well aware now, certainly more informed of the whole open source movement in the RPA world. So thank you. And yeah, let's have a think about whether there's another episode down the line when we discuss something similar. And thank you for listening this week. And I will speak to you all again soon.